Welcome to Pure Passion. My name is David Kyle Foster, and I'm your host. We have a tremendous treat for you on today's program. His name is Joe Dallas. Joe is one of the world's most respected teachers in the area of sexual sin and brokenness. His books have populated the Christian charts for over a decade. Joe was at one time a pastor in a gay church, and at the same time a sex addict, hopelessly addicted to pornography. One day, God opened his eyes to see the truth, that Jesus had died to set him free from sexual brokenness and the sin that it gives birth to. Now married with kids, Joe's background makes him uniquely positioned to speak about sexual sin from both the heterosexual and the homosexual perspectives. An earmark of every teaching from Joe Dallas is biblical balance. Throughout the year, we're going to air special teaching segments recorded by Joe for Pure Passion based on his book, The Game Plan. But first, let's hear the fascinating life story of Joe Dallas as told by Joe himself.
I was routinely molested sexually from the time I was 8 until I was 10 by a handful of men in my city who were pretty adept at gaining the trust of young boys and seducing them and then engaging them sexually in exchange for money, gifts, affection. And there's no question that played into my confusion later on in my life. And then my own decisions, I'd have to factor in there. I mean, I decided for years to experiment sexually with anyone who would allow me, girls in junior high school and high school, adult men when I was in high school. I began using pornography while I was still in elementary school. So I think the factors that contributed to it would include my own emotional brokenness long before I was introduced to sex, the sexual violations, and then my own responses to those violations. I did not know God at all, no. Although it's interesting you ask that, I did believe there must be something out there. In fact, I took real comfort at night in praying to whatever was out there. It was hard for me to believe there was not a God. But by the time I was in junior high school, I knew that if there was a God, he couldn't possibly approve of the fact that I was already sexually promiscuous, that I spent a good deal of my time living in the netherworld of pornography and sexual fantasy, or that I was already using dope. And for those reasons, while I believed there must be a God, I also was afraid of facing God. I think if you ask anyone who has been either sexually molested or physically abused, they'll tell you that there are lies you begin to believe when that happens. You tend to believe that that is love, that what people want from you is either physical or sexual, that what matters the most in life is power, how to get it, how to keep it, that you don't have much to offer apart from that. And so when I would pray after having been molested, I thought that God probably was watching. I just didn't think he cared. And I was hoping if I could get his attention, maybe he would notice me and do something to either put me in a more loving environment or give me the strength to say no to this, or somehow race me through my childhood so I could skip the years until I was old enough to be on my own. In other words, I thought that God knew, I just didn't think it mattered to him. It didn't even occur to me to get angry at God until much later in life. I didn't believe as a child that I had the right to be angry at anyone. Most of the people in my life either bullied me or abused me or humiliated me. And when that's what you get from most of the people in your life, you learn what I call a conviction of non-entitlement. You believe that you're not entitled to be hurt. You're not entitled to be angry. And so I assumed that God was just one more of the many people who didn't much care what happened to Joe Dallas, and I assumed that that meant Joe Dallas wasn't of much value. If you really don't think you're of much value, you don't think you have a case against anybody. So it never occurred to me to be angry, only afraid. I remember the first time it happened, the man met me in the lobby of a theater in the downtown area, and he struck up a conversation with me, and won my trust and seemed to be a very nice, normal-looking man, by the way. And when he asked me if I needed to use the restroom and followed me, and I did not think anything wrong was about to happen, I noticed he was very nervous watching the other people in the restroom and waiting for them to leave. And when they finally did, he shoved me into a restroom stall and began to take me sexually. And when he did, I remembered thinking a variety of things. He likes me. I'm not sure what he wants, but whatever it is, I don't want him not to like me, because I finally got a grown man who likes me. He is telling me this is the right thing to do, so it must be. This feels weird to me, but I must be wrong, which, by the way, taught me not to trust my own instincts. All of my own instincts were saying, it's all right to touch me on the shoulder, but everything else you're doing is wrong. My whole body screamed out against that. But I pushed that down because I assumed this grown man knew better than I did, and after all, he liked me. And if he liked me, I didn't have any right to say no to him. So I learned simultaneously not to trust my instincts, that this is what it meant to be liked. And in my distorted thinking, I assumed that this was what I had to offer. So those, in essence, were the thoughts going through my mind. My father was a very hardworking man, and my father seemed to feel from the time I was a boy that I was not what he wanted. Now, I never quite understood why or what I could have done, but from day one, I felt, whether correctly or incorrectly, that I was unacceptable to him. So I was very hungry for a man, a father figure, to bless me, affirm me, identify with me, welcome me into his manhood and his masculinity. And not getting that where I wanted it, I was willing to take it wherever I could get it. Well, that's where I got it, or at least what I thought was it. I think that I sensed more keenly a clear rejection from my father. I think I sensed from my mother exhaustion. I think she loved me. In fact, in retrospect, I'm convinced both my parents loved me very much. But at the time, there were things I needed from both of them that they didn't seem able or willing to supply. After the first encounter I had with this man who I met in the downtown area, he did introduce me to other men. There were other kids in my neighborhood who frequented the hotel that these guys owned, and they would show us pornography. Now, at that time, Playboy, I believe a couple of other men's magazines, and some very amateurish, grainy, black and white films were just about the only game in town when it came to pornography. But they would show that to us to, help arouse us and create a generally erotic environment for their practices. But that got me fascinated with pornography. And I began, by the time I was in 5th grade, learning to swipe Playboy magazines and a couple of the other magazines that were common at that time from liquor stores, where they would be kept on the lower cabinet, and stuff them under my t-shirt and bicycle away. And then by the time I learned how to masturbate in about early 7th grade, I was routinely using pornography as a masturbation aid. So for that reason, unfortunately, I picked up the porn habit very early in life and learned to rely on it, I think, much the way an addict or an alcoholic relies on a chemical to help them function. It wasn't uncommon for me to spend hours per week just fantasizing and losing myself in a world I would create just by looking at the pornographic images. And of course, that gave me a very distorted idea of what is supposed to happen between men and women, and what people are there for, and what love is about.
Your passion that beats for Christ alone. Your passion.
I would say, especially when I hit the junior high school age, I pretty much cut off any emotional connection with Dad. Now, the great irony of that, by that time, I think my dad was reaching out to me. I think he was concerned about me. He could see that I was withdrawn. He could see my grades going down. He could see that I sort of lived in my own world. And I know it bothered him. And I think he tried, in his own faltering way, to say, son, I care about you. I don't know where you are, and I'd like to know where you are. But I had already decided by then, this guy is hurtful, this guy is ignorant, this guy is a source of too much pain, he's not going to understand, I don't want to deal with him. So in essence, I gave my dad a death sentence. I basically said, off with your head. And from then until my adulthood, I emotionally was completely disconnected from him. I was born again when I was 16. I heard the gospel. I was dating a girl who I was pretty crazy about, and she was chaste, which fascinated me because this was the early 70s. It was the height of the sexual revolution. Everybody was doing it. But she was different, and the difference was very clear. She took me to a church with her. I heard the gospel, went under conviction. For about 3 months, I wrestled with God until finally I said yes and was born again, very quietly on my own. I got into fellowship, started reading the Word, started growing to an extent, and those first few years were wonderful. Then I got into full-time ministry. Now, immediately after being born again, I walked away from pornography, homosexuality, heterosexual fornication, all of it. Just cut it all off, no problem there. Still lusted and fantasized, occasionally masturbated, but by and large, all the acting out, the overt stuff, I walked away from immediately. But I did think that having been born again, I should reach a point where I could never be tempted again. Now, nobody ever overtly told me that, but I thought it was true nonetheless. And you know, at that time, oddly enough, even though America was in the midst of a blatant casting off of sexual restraint, in the church, sex was still largely unaddressed. When I went to church, I heard testimonies about everything, but I never heard testimonies about anyone delivered from fornication, pornography, or homosexuality. So I assumed I was the only one who had ever struggled with those things, and I sure wasn't going to be the only freak in the congregation, so I kept that to myself. And it built and it built. I would not deal with it when I would lust or fantasize until finally, after 7 years as a Christian, when I was 23 years old, I walked into an adult bookstore, curious about hardcore pornography. And that set into motion a level of lasciviousness that I had never engaged in before. I began using hookers. I had an affair with a married woman and terminated in a pregnancy that terminated in an abortion. Met the owner of a gay bar, got into a relationship with him for about a year. And after that, heard about a church where you could be both gay and Christian. And I thought, now that's the answer, because I had been so raunchy for the past year or so that I thought, gee, I can't live this way, but I wasn't quite ready to give up my own kind of sex either. And so when I heard you could have it both ways, I thought, that's it, perfect. And so I joined the gay church, the Metropolitan Community Church. And I was with them for about 4 to 5 years, even served on staff with them for a time. But all the time there was a nagging voice saying, you're kidding yourself. And I would shove that down and do what I wanted to do until finally in January of 1984, God, I think very quietly, was convicting me and drawing me back because I was so hungry and restless. I mean, there was no big catastrophe going on in my life, but I was very dissatisfied. And I wasn't sure what for, because my life was going reasonably well, decent job, circle of friends, social life, what have you, but I was very hungry for the fellowship with God that I had had until I finally realized, even if God has not cast me off, even if this isn't going to send me to hell, I don't have the intimacy with him I used to have, and I want that back. And that's when I repented. I believe the primary deception of the gay church is one of entitlement. If something feels natural to you, you're entitled to it. Your satisfaction, your gratification is what counts the most. In fact, I'd have to say this respectfully but clearly, so far the testimonies I have heard from people who call themselves gay Christians are based largely on a celebration of self-acceptance rather than discipleship. And I think that's the primary deception, is that the most important thing in life is for you to accept yourself just as you are, and then feel comfortable just as you are, and then slap a Christian label on that and say you are a follower of Jesus Christ because you think he's wonderful, you love him, and in some ways you obey him, but the acceptance of your sexuality was the real turning point in your life. To my thinking, that's anything but a biblical concept. A large part of the biblical concept of following Christ is dying, after all. I had to look at the fact that I had made a god of Joe Dallas. My great sin when I backslid into homosexuality was not homosexuality or fornication or adultery or pornography. Those were symptomatic of a greater sin. I had said, in essence, I matter more than God. My satisfaction, my feelings, my gratification means more to me than breaking the heart of God by my behavior. It was idolatry. And out of that idolatry, all sorts of uncleanness sprang out, both sexual uncleanness and moral uncleanness of many types.
Your passion that beats for Christ alone. Your passion. Your passion.
Over the next few programs, I'm going to be talking about the issue of what does it look like to be healed from homosexual confusion. I've been on many a talk show where a gay activist will say to me, "Are you still tempted to commit a homosexual act from time to time?" And when I say yes, they'll say, "See, you're not healed." But their criteria for what healing is corrupt. For example, I used to smoke cigarettes, and I smoked cigarettes for a good 10 to 15 years. But I quit when I was in my 20s, and that's been 25 years ago. I quit. But you know what? I was tempted to smoke the other day, but I didn't. According to the criteria of the gay activist, because I was tempted, I would still have to call myself a smoker, even though I haven't smoked in 25 years. You see how ludicrous their thinking is? Just because you're tempted to do something doesn't mean that's who you are. Your temptations do not define you. So let me talk at length now about what it really looks like to be healed of homosexual confusion. First, if Spirit-led healing is occurring, over time you will see primary shifts in your behavior, in your identity, in your fantasy life, and in your attractions. Primary shifts. You see, the Holy Spirit is God. If you have given Him permission to be the Lord of your life, He will do exactly that. That means when you pursue sin, He will bring conviction and correction. And when sin pursues you, if you turn to God instead of trying to fight it out on your own, God will deliver you from that temptation. And He will give the exact amount of power that you need and that you believe Him for to resist the temptation. When temptations come, the person who is well on the way to healing and transformation will consistently and quickly put them away. That's what healing looks like. Notice I didn't say if the temptations come. I said when the temptations come. You see, you will always have memories of past pleasures, no matter what your sin has been. Old mental videotapes of events that have brought great excitement and thrills in the past. The difference in a healed person is that they have had such a change of heart and have acquired such a level of discipline that such temptations are consistently rejected upon arrival. They don't give in to them anymore. They don't give them any time. They don't give them any consideration. In their mind and heart, that sin is no longer an option. Additionally, when temptations come, they effectively and they efficiently turn the battle over to God on a consistent basis, rather than trying to fight it out on their own. A healed person has learned to let God fight their battles for them. Long past are the self-righteous attempts to prove oneself holy and above sin. Dead and buried is the idea that we became self-contained, self-made entities of holiness. This person has learned that power over sin only comes from the throne of God, and it must be sought immediately and relied upon completely when being tempted.
Your passion that beats for Christ alone. Your passion, nothing less I will offer Him.
Hi, I'm Cy. I'm here with another question and sharing some thoughts about that with you today. Question that's come in: is emotional dependency on the same sex considered homosexuality? I suppose it depends. So without knowing more details, I guess I'd summarize it like this. Emotional dependency is simply a condition where we look to another person to be the source of our value and security. All of us are born dependent. All of us need big investments from others over a course of years to grow up feeling that we are valued and to learn life skills to navigate in our world. A lot of people don't get their cup topped up, and they are hungry to feel valued. Just because you're attracted to the same sex in that way doesn't necessarily equal homosexuality, so don't draw that mistaken conclusion. Certainly, however, it is true that emotional dependency can affect relationship and become unhealthy when you become really overly clingy and looking to one other person to be everything you need, like a kind of personal security blanket. I would encourage you to realize if that sounds like you, you're not bad, God's certainly not mad, but you're not doing yourself any favors when you look to one other human to be all that you need, because really no one other human can give you all that you need. That's why finally, as we learn to grow up, we learn to look beyond frail, limited mortals, and we realize that they can't live up to all of our expectations all the time. And even when we have a wonderful friend or spouse or counselor, our time with them and our lives, in fact, on earth are quite temporary and limited. And looking beyond them to God, He's the eternal constant. People come and go. Friends fail our expectations. Even spouses sometimes leave us. But there is a God who never will, as we look to Him as the truest source for that bread that feeds the hunger in our soul to feel loved and valued. Sometimes dependencies occur spouse to spouse, or parent to child, or even friend to friend. It's understandable that we look to those around us as a tangible form of security and support. And indeed, God will sometimes put His skin on and love us through other people, but as a support and not the source. I've had to experience that in my own journey, where I used to look to other people that if I could just find that one special person, all my deepest inner appetites and needs would be satisfied. But I've been mistaken about that, and often would even alienate people as I overattach and begin to cling in ways that really weren't healthy. But you know, as I began to look beyond the horizontal relationships with others, I began to look beyond them and look up toward God, I found that even though I can't quite touch Him tangibly, He could become tangible in the way that He would affect me and love me. And He would love me through other people, and putting their skin on, I wouldn't look to one person, but a whole variety of ingredients to satisfy that hunger in my soul. So if you find yourself looking to others, sure, in times of need, we need others to support us, but ultimately they're not the source. We need to look beyond them to the true God who is eternal and constant, becoming the real bread that feeds your need. Those are my thoughts about that.
It certainly is true that no one has the corner of the market of God's love and His attention. If God was interested in interrupting my life, He is interested in interrupting anybody's life, and very concerned. So I think the next step to take is to ask Him to give you the ability to believe, to grasp His concern and His love for you. To ask Him to give you a vision of your life that He has. To ask Him to give you His dissatisfaction with your life and His care that your life become what He needs it to be. I think that's a great place to start.
Perhaps you've been struggling with homosexuality and would like to find the healing and transformation that Joe has found. You can, you know. God wants to set you free as well. He also wants to bring others around you who can show you how to find the healing that you've needed for your sexual identity. Some of you may have struggled with addictions of the heterosexual kind. Perhaps porn has been your god, and you want out. You've made a Faustian deal, and you want Jesus to destroy that contract through His sacrifice for your sins. He can, you know, and He will if you will simply turn to Him and ask Him. All power in heaven and earth has been given to Him to set anyone free from any bondage. Offer Him your life and ask Him to be your Lord. Ask Him to tear down the idols that have ruled you and to be your only Lord and God. Ask Him for the power you need to walk in holiness, and ask Him to speak the words of love and affirmation into your spirit that you've always longed to hear. That's exactly what He wants to do. Make these commitments today, beloved, and find the peace, freedom, and satisfaction that only Christ can bring. I'll be looking forward to reading your testimonies on our website. Just go to purepassion.us. Until next week, I'm David Kyle Foster for Pure Passion, wishing you God's very best.